It is 1945, and World War II is nearing its brutal climax. The Pacific theater of war is raging with intensity, and one of the most significant aspects of this conflict is the experience of prisoners of war, POWs. Among the most tragic and overlooked stories are those of the Japanese women who found themselves caught in this horrific web of violence and cruelty. They had once been the daughters, sisters, and wives of soldiers and civilians, caught up in the chaos of a nation at war. Now they were held captive by their enemies in unimaginable conditions. These women had no idea what to expect as they entered the prison camps. What followed would change their understanding of the human spirit, and it would change the course of the war for them. The war was pushing forward with no mercy. The Allies were slowly advancing toward the Japanese homeland, and American forces in particular had pushed into Japanese-occupied territories. These occupied islands became the sites of brutal conflicts and horrifying wartime conditions. As the war raged, Japanese soldiers were determined to fight to the bitter end. But not all those in uniform were men. Among the civilians, many women had been pressed into service in various roles, including auxiliary workers in military factories and transport units. The line between combatants and non-combatants had blurred, and many of these women would soon find themselves prisoners of war, caught in a vicious battle of survival. The tide was shifting. The United States had begun to successfully push forward, securing victory after victory in battles like the Battle of Okinawa, where they had claimed territory that had been fiercely defended by the Japanese forces. With each victory, the Allies tightened their grip on the Japanese Empire. It was in the midst of this rising pressure that the Japanese women found themselves in the hands of the enemy. They were herded into cramped, unsanitary prison camps, their futures uncertain. For many of them, it was their first exposure to the horrors of war on such an intimate and personal level. Some had been sent to serve in the factories of occupied territories. Others had been pressed into military support roles, only to be captured when the battlefronts collapsed. Now their captors were American soldiers, hardened by years of fighting, but also by the moral complexities of a war that seemed to drag on endlessly. The prison camps were a far cry from the wartime propaganda that had once glorified the strength of the Japanese Empire. Instead of the mighty warriors depicted in the Japanese government's tales, the women in these camps were subjected to conditions that stripped them of their dignity. Hunger, disease, overcrowding, and brutal treatment at the hands of both Japanese and American forces were their daily reality. The emotional toll of these conditions left deep scars, yet there was another aspect of this captivity that no one had prepared them for: the unexpected kindness shown by their American captors. The Americans had long been viewed by the Japanese as the enemy, the other, who had to be destroyed at all costs. But the reality on the ground was often more complex than the narratives of war that had been instilled in both sides. It was not uncommon for POWs to be treated with disdain, or even cruelty, by their captors. But as the war continued, American soldiers, many of whom were young and deeply conflicted by the violence they had witnessed, began to experience something of a moral awakening. They found themselves face to face with the very people they had been taught to hate, and as time passed, some began to see them as victims of the war as well. In a moment that would challenge the traditional boundaries of war and humanity, these women POWs witnessed something that they would not have expected in 1,000 years: Americans laughing with their prisoners. The laughter, at first, was a strange and disorienting sound in the context of their captivity. In a place that was supposed to be filled with suffering and hatred, these moments of joy between captors and captives would lead to profound changes in the prisoners' understanding of the enemy. The tension was palpable in those moments. The women looked on in disbelief, trying to comprehend what was happening. Here, in the midst of this brutal war, there were Americans who had not only shown them compassion but had shared a laugh with them, a bond that seemed incongruous with the nature of war itself. The moment seemed surreal, but it held a powerful significance. It was a glimpse of the humanity that existed even in the most dire of situations. But how had this happened? How could the Americans, who were once seen as the embodiment of hatred and death, become human to their prisoners? The answer lies in the transformation that took place in the hearts and minds of the soldiers who saw their enemies not as faceless figures of evil, but as people. This unusual turn of events would become emblematic of a new phase in the war, where humanity itself would begin to be tested in the most unlikely of ways. For the women who had been captured, this shift in perspective was a moment of revelation. It was not just a moment of humanity, but of recognition. Their captors, too, were victims of war. They, too, had been dehumanized by the very forces they had been sent to fight. And for a brief, fleeting moment, this mutual understanding broke the unspoken barriers that had separated the two sides. In the midst of the destruction, a moment of peace had emerged, one that would leave a lasting impact on the Japanese women, and on the American soldiers as well. For those who had endured so much suffering, the realization that their enemies could also share in their humanity was an unexpected and powerful one. It was a brief but profound shift that would define the rest of the war for these women, and for the soldiers who had fought them. The world was changing rapidly in 1945. The winds of war had shifted decisively against Japan, and as the Allied forces closed in on the Japanese homeland, the fate of the nation was all but sealed. The intensity of the conflict, particularly in the Pacific, was now a series of horrifyingly brutal encounters, with both sides suffering unimaginable losses. The Americans, emboldened by the victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, had begun their relentless march toward Japan's heart. The Japanese, however, refused to yield. Their military strategies and nationalism entwined with the belief that surrender was not an option. In this atmosphere of extreme tension, the women who found themselves captured in American POW camps could not escape the harsh realities of a war that had consumed everything around them. These women, who had once lived in relative normalcy, had become casualties of a war they were not prepared to fight. Many had been conscripted into war labor, toiling in factories or serving in military roles, believing that they were contributing to Japan's imperial ambitions. They had been told they were the foundation of the nation's power. But now, in the heat of conflict, they were nothing more than pawns in a game played by men with visions of conquest and dominance. For the women held captive by American forces, the days were long and filled with despair. The camps were overcrowded, their hygiene inadequate, and the food barely enough to sustain life. Yet the women found themselves facing a new reality. Their captors, the very soldiers they had once been taught to fear, were offering them something unexpected: compassion, and in some cases, camaraderie. The transformation of their captors' attitudes did not happen overnight, nor did it come easily. It was the result of a complex interplay of human emotion, political circumstances, and the shared humanity that war often brings into stark relief. The turning point for many American soldiers came when they began to see the prisoners not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. As the horrors of war continued, the soldiers began to question the very premise of the conflict. They had been taught to hate, to view the enemy as faceless, as an obstacle to their national and military objectives. But now, as they interacted with their prisoners, they found themselves reconsidering the narratives they had once held as truth. In many of the POW camps, the women were treated with a surprising level of respect. Though they were still prisoners, American soldiers began to share their food, water, and even small luxuries when they could afford to. They spoke to the women, not as enemies, but as people who had been caught in the same unrelenting storm of war. The women, who had once been indoctrinated with a deep sense of nationalism and duty to their country, found themselves confronted with the possibility that their captors were not the monsters they had been led to believe. This was a profound realization for the women. The psychological toll of war had been immense, and yet here, in the cold, damp prison camps, something miraculous was happening. The walls that had separated the captor from the captive were slowly beginning to crumble. It was not an easy process. Years of war had created deep scars, both physical and psychological. But in those fleeting moments of connection, when laughter echoed across the camp, or when a soldier extended a hand of assistance, there was a palpable sense of something deeper than the conflict. There was a recognition that, despite the cruelty of war, some things transcended national borders, some things that could not be contained by ideology or hatred. The role of leadership in this transformation is worth noting. On both sides, the decisions made by military leaders and commanders shaped the conditions of the camps, but it was the individual actions of the soldiers in the field, in the everyday moments, that had the most profound effect. In these moments of humanity, leadership took on a new form. It was not about winning the war or securing strategic advantages. It was about the human connections that developed in the most unlikely of circumstances. For many of the women, these fleeting moments were a balm to their souls. They had been subjected to so much: the brutal, dehumanizing treatment at the hands of their captors, the fear, the hunger, the diseases that ravaged their bodies. Yet here in the dark corners of the camp they found light, however brief. They found laughter, companionship, and even fleeting joy. These women had been told that they were inferior, that they had no place in the world beyond serving the war machine of their country. But now they were witnessing something that had eluded them for years: kindness, compassion, and a sense of shared humanity. They began to wonder whether they could ever go back to the way they had once thought of their enemies, whether they could ever reconcile the faces of the men who had shown them humanity with the propaganda they had been taught. The impact of these moments on the soldiers was equally profound. The tension that had built up over the years of combat began to unravel. The realization that they had been fighting people who were just as human as they were was not something that could be ignored. As the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion, many soldiers found themselves questioning the purpose of it all. The war had taken so much from so many. It had destroyed families, shattered cities, and torn apart entire cultures. And yet, here they were, sitting with the very people they had been told to destroy, sharing something as simple as a laugh or a moment of understanding. This was no ordinary conflict. It was a war that had changed the very nature of humanity. The relationships that developed between the American soldiers and the Japanese women were more than just a shift in the emotional tenor of the war. They marked the beginning of a new kind of understanding between enemy forces. The laughter, the smiles, and the shared experiences were more than just acts of kindness. They were the seeds of post-war reconciliation. The emotional scars of the war would take years to heal, but these moments showed that humanity could find a way to survive even in the darkest times. The end of World War II came with an undeniable sense of relief, but it also left a complex legacy of suffering, trauma, and a search for healing. For the women who had been held as prisoners by the Americans, their lives were irrevocably altered by the war. They had entered the prison camps as enemies, labeled as part of the machine of Imperial Japan. But through the agonizing months of captivity, they experienced something that defied the ideology and hatred that had once defined the relationship between the two nations. They had been shown kindness and compassion in places where cruelty and violence had been expected. The lasting impact of these experiences was far-reaching, not just for the women themselves, but for the men who had been their captors as well. The aftermath of the war saw Japan's unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945. The Americans, under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, oversaw the occupation and reconstruction of Japan, aiming to reshape its society, government, and economy. For many of the women who had been POWs, the return to civilian life was fraught with challenges. They had been forced into labor, subjected to unimaginable conditions, and then forced to rebuild their lives in a country that had been utterly devastated by war. Yet even in the wreckage of their own shattered worlds, they carried with them the unexpected lesson that had emerged in the prison camps. This lesson, however, was not one that was easily recognized by the larger Japanese society. The country's national identity had been built on a fierce sense of pride and duty, values that had been twisted to fuel the war machine. The idea that a prisoner, especially a female prisoner, could be treated with humanity by the enemy was an uncomfortable truth for many. For the soldiers who had shown kindness, the memory of those fleeting moments with the women POWs was not something they could easily forget. The war had been fought over land, power, and control, but in the end it was these simple human moments that left the deepest scars and the most profound changes. For the American soldiers, too, the emotional toll of the war was deep and lasting. Many had seen things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives: the violence, the death, the destruction. But they had also seen the humanity in their enemies. They had shared in the pain of war with the women they had once seen only as adversaries. The emotional journey that they had undergone mirrored the larger process of reconciliation that would unfold in the years after the war ended. The immediate aftermath of the war saw a rapid effort to reintegrate the Japanese prisoners into society, but the true process of healing both for the soldiers and the women, would take much longer. Psychologically, the war had altered both sides in ways that were often difficult to comprehend. For the women, the traumatic experience of being imprisoned, of surviving in a foreign land under harsh conditions, and of being forced to abandon everything they knew was a deeply scarring one. Yet the moments of humanity that emerged between captor and captive allowed them to begin to rebuild, to see the world not only in terms of war and destruction, but also in terms of compassion and shared experience. For the American soldiers, the war had shown them the limits of human cruelty and the importance of human connection. They had been trained to kill, to fight, and to win, but through the laughter and compassion they shared with their captives, they had been reminded of something fundamental, that even in the darkest times, it was humanity that had the power to break through. The legacy of these moments, these exchanges between captor and captive, did not end with the conclusion of the war. They would go on to shape the post-war interactions between the United States and Japan. The American occupation of Japan, which lasted from 1945 until 1952, brought about an era of intense transformation for the Japanese people. Under the leadership of General MacArthur, Japan was demilitarized, its economy was rebuilt, and its political structure was radically overhauled. In many ways, this period marked the beginning of Japan's emergence as a democratic and peaceful nation. The shared experiences of captivity, of humanizing the enemy, played a small but significant role in this process of transformation. The very people who had once been enemies were now sharing in the task of reconstruction. The American soldiers who had participated in the war, many of whom had witnessed or been part of the moments of connection with the women prisoners, found themselves returning to a changed world. They had been forever altered by the war, by the experiences they had lived through. For some, the impact of the war was so profound that it would remain with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen the depths of human suffering, but they had also seen the power of human kindness. The soldiers who laughed with their prisoners, shared in their pain, and began to understand them as human beings would return home with a new perspective on the world and on the enemy they had fought. For the women, the return to normalcy after the war was fraught with difficulty. They had endured the physical and emotional scars of war, and now they had to find a way to move forward in a world that had changed beyond recognition. Yet despite the hardships, many found ways to rebuild their lives. They did so with the knowledge that even in the darkest days of their captivity, they had witnessed something remarkable, the power of human connection in the face of war. And they carried this with them as they worked to heal their nations, their families, and themselves. The broader implications of the event cannot be overstated. The Second World War reshaped the global order, but it also reshaped the way humanity understood itself. The war was fought with incredible intensity, but it was also fought with moments of compassion and understanding. These moments, though fleeting, demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit. The kindness shown by the American soldiers and the response of the Japanese women reflected something deeper than the animosity of the battlefield. They reflected a recognition that, despite the forces that divided them, there was something that united them all: the shared experience of suffering, survival, and the hope for peace. As we look back on the events of World War II, it is easy to focus on the battles, the strategies, the victories and defeats, but it is the human stories, the moments of kindness, of humanity that endure. The story of the Japanese women POWs, their experiences in captivity, and their encounters with American soldiers remind us that, even in the darkest times, there is always the potential for light. It is this humanity in all its complexity that remains at the heart of history, offering lessons that transcend the conflicts of the past and shape the world we live in today.